Hi, everyone. I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in today to this very exciting episode of Alta Asks Live. My name is Beth Spotswood. I am Alta's digital editor. Today we have Alta Asks Live is the kind of live streamed version of Alta Asks, which is normally an author Q&A series we do at altaonline.com. Today is special and exciting. We have David Silverman of LA House Histories. David was profiled in Alta magazine by James Bartlett, an Alta contributor who's spectacular. And he's so interesting, we wanted to kind of have a talk with him and take a peek into some of LA's most storied, historic, fabulous homes. So really briefly, what I'm gonna do is a short kind of Q&A with David, then he's going to take us on a slideshow adventure. So stop what you're doing, stop cooking, stop texting. You're really going to want to pay attention to this one. Again, if you're unfamiliar with Alta, I know we've got a lot of new people here today, and I want to say a big shout out to Shirley's Army. I understand we have a lot of Shirley Temple fans here today, so hi guys. We are Alta Magazine. We are a quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. You can visit us at altaonline.com. And now, David, can you just briefly tell me what is it that you do? What is LA House Histories?
I do various products that are related to historic houses. So the biggest thing are the books. So homeowners will hire me to write a book about their house or a house of a friend as a gift. And it can take form as a book. It could be a portfolio of photos. Architects and interior designers hire me to find photos. So it's really any visual or information material about an older home. And it doesn't have to be a famous historic home. It just has to be older, whether it's from the 20s to the 60s.
Now, I hope you don't mind my asking, and I realize that there's a ballpark, but how much would it cost to have you create a history of my home?
It all depends on the amount of time that I spend on it. So I just finished a book that took 2 years. That's 350 pages. And something like that would be tens of thousands. But I've also worked for people for just a couple hours. And in those couple hours, I can often find historic photos of their house. And that's all they're looking for are photos. Or for a house that doesn't take 2 years, then it would be a lot less expensive. So it really depends on what the client wants. Do they want a book? Do they want a portfolio? Do they just want photos for a couple hours? And how much time I take.
And these are private. We can't buy these. We can't see them. This is just for your client. This is a private book that your client keeps, and it's not available at Vroman's.
Right. Wow. Actually, the model that I had was from when I was a kid, and they had those books where you would tell them your name and you would get a book that was a children's book. Do you remember those? And it was a story, and in the book it would have your name, so you would be the character. And for whatever reason, I think that stuck with me, and so 40 years later I thought of that. So yeah, they're privately commissioned books, so they're just for the owner. I don't sell them, or they're not available in stores.
Which makes them even more special. All right, so folks, while you're watching, if you think of any questions, if there are photos that you want David to try and revisit after he does this presentation, shoot me a note in the comments here. We will, or you can ask a question below. We'll try and make that happen. With that, David, have at it.
Thanks. I need to share the screen. You can't see the...
Right, so David's going to share his screen with us, and we're going to look at these incredible photos. I got a sneak peek at them, I will confess.
Okay. And people might want to do the screen full screen, because some of the photos in the slides are small.
Noted.
Okay. So these, here we go. So these are some of the things I do. On the left are two of the books I've written. And in the middle are what they look like inside. They're designed by an incredible graphic designer. And on the bottom right is something I did for a 1920s house that wasn't owned by anyone famous. And it was actually a 20-page booklet that the owner gave to his family for Christmas. So these houses don't have to be owned by Shirley Temple, like the one on the left, or Frank Sinatra on the top left, David Selznick in the center. They often work for any older home. And it might not be a 350-page book, but I can do something. These are some of the other things I do. The top left is a leather portfolio that I put together with photos of a Cliff May house from the 1930s. At the bottom are custom clamshell boxes that have all sorts of historic photos or maps and aerials, architectural drawings of a house. And as I mentioned, I work with architects, interior designers, and landscape designers when they're working on an older home and they want to see what it used to look like and have that information inform their design on the house. In the center is a great photo I found from a 1959 house, and the owners recently bought it and they restored it, and they used these photos when they were remodeling the house to the way it used to look. And I left my job as a lawyer 2 years ago to do this full time. And what you see here are just a portion of what I've done so far. A lot of people ask where I find all this information. These are some of the places. I often go to collectors and Shirley's Army. Hello, everyone. So when I wrote a book about Shirley's house, I contacted the Facebook group, Shirley's Army, and they provided some amazing stuff, photos and information that I incorporated in the book. I often go to the people who used to live in the house, either the people themselves who used to live there or their relatives if they're no longer alive. And then I'll go to photo archives, universities, old magazines, old fan magazines from the 30s and 40s are terrific. Old architectural digests, any old architecture magazine often has houses, old houses in LA. So all sorts of places. I'll look everywhere. So we'll start with Louis B. Mayer. He was the co-founder of MGM and the head of the studio for 27 years, from 1924 to 1951. And you see him on the left with Shirley Temple and Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. And that's him in the center with his family, his wife, Margaret. They're there in 1930, and his two daughters, Edie on the left and Irene. And just a crazy coincidence, I've written books about both Edie and Irene's homes. And Edie married Bill Getz, and Irene, her sister, married David Selznick. And David Selznick was the producer of Gone with the Wind, and the next year he got another Best Picture Oscar for Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, and he's the only producer ever to win 2 consecutive Best Picture Oscars. And so they got married in 1930, both sisters. And as a wedding gift to each of his daughters, Louis B. Mayer, everyone called him LB, Louis B. Mayer gave each daughter a new house. And it wasn't just the house, it was the land, it was the construction costs and furnishing the house. And Irene and David Selznick built this house in 1928, or actually 1934, sorry. This is a photo from 1924, and they bought the land in red. And the Beverly Hills Hotel is right in the center where Sunset Boulevard, so you can kind of know where this is. Here's a close-up view of it. That's the land that the Selznicks bought. Charlie Chaplin lived across the street. Pickfair was the legendary house of Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. And in the 1920s, that house was the center of Hollywood's social activities. And we'll see the Getz house, which became the center of Hollywood's social life in the 1940s through the 60s. And this is the house that the Selznicks built. So they built it in 1934. It cost them $12,000 for the land and $75,000 to build this house. And I just finished a 250-page book about this house earlier this year. And one reason why it took so long was because so many famous people owned it. So you can see the famous people listed above the house. When David and Irene got a divorce, Irene sold the house, but before she did, she rented it to Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn separately. And then Irene sold it to one of the Doheny's. Later, Sammy Davis Jr. bought it, and Ed McMahon owned it later. So it just had a ton of history. And those are the Selznicks on the right. David O. Selznick, his wife Irene, Irene Mayer, and their two sons, Jeffrey and Danny. This is the house under construction. They hired a landscape designer who's very well known in Southern California. Her name was Florence Yoke, and that's the house today. They hired her as the house was being designed, so she actually took this photo of the house and drew the landscaping in. That's her drawing of the trees. And that's what the house looked like. And that's Louis B. Mayer in the backyard with Danny and Jeffrey. And David liked her work on the house so much that he hired Florence to do the landscaping on Gone with the Wind. And she only did the landscaping on Tara. So she went to Georgia to study the plants and greenery around plantations. And then since the movie was filmed in Culver City, the upper right, that's actually the house on a backlot in Culver City, she would try to make these California trees look like Georgia trees. And that's in the corner is David O. Selznick with Louis B. Mayer, his brother-in-law, his father-in-law, and Clark Gable. They're signing the contract for Gone with the Wind. And David O. Selznick's sister-in-law, so Irene's sister Edie, bought this house. This wasn't the first house that she bought with Bill Getz. This was her second. And Edie lived here for 43 years. And they bought the house in 1947. So Louis B. Mayer didn't pay for this one. He paid for the one before. And that's the house in 1969. I just finished a 350-page book about this one. The Getzes didn't build it. So it was built in 1938 by a couple named Eugene and Wynn Hill Smith. He was the heir to a Michigan manufacturing fortune. And I got in touch with his wife's daughter-in-law, and she gave me that bathroom towel in the center, and embroidered on it in her handwriting is Wynwood. And since her name was Wynn Hill Smith, she named the house after herself, Wynwood. And the daughter-in-law also gave me these terrific construction photos of the house under construction. The architect was Gordon Kaufman, who also did Greystone. And then the house later appeared in Architectural Digest. That's the back of the house at the bottom. And when they sold the house, they sold it to Ann Miller. And Ann Miller was with MGM when she's the famous tap dancer who it was said that she would tap 500 taps a minute. When she came to Hollywood, she was 20, and she started dating Louis B. Mayer after he left his wife. And she was 20 and he was 60. And he told her not to marry her husband the one that she wanted to, but she did anyway, and they got a divorce less than a year after they got married. So she only lived in the house for less than a year. That's her at a photo shoot in the back of the house in 1946. And then when Anne got a divorce, the house was sold to the Getzes in 1947. So here's Bill and Edie, and they hired Billy Haynes to do the interior of the house. He was the legendary interior designer who really defined the Hollywood Regency style. And from the 30s to the 70s in LA, he did a who's who of homes of Hollywood moguls, stars, and business executives. And he actually has a connection too with Louis B. Mayer. He was a silent movie star at MGM. And Louis B. Mayer gave him an ultimatum one day: either give up your boyfriend and marry a woman, or Louis B. Mayer would cancel his contract. And Haynes chose to leave acting and stay with his boyfriend, and they lived together for the next 47 years. And he quit acting to become an interior designer. And he would design nearly every piece of furniture in the houses he did. And in the Getz house, every single piece of furniture you see was custom designed by Billy, except for two. This is the living room, and it was one of the best known screening rooms in Hollywood. And Edie would sit on the left on that couch in the back. She would talk to the projectionist behind her with a telephone, and she would push buttons to raise the movie screen on the opposite wall. That's on the bottom right. Right above that, the panel on the wall would lift up where those three paintings are, which were bolted to that panel. And those little windows are the projection booths. And so they would have these screenings after dinner. And this is the house in 1940 when the Hill Smiths owned it. And then this is what it looked like, the Billy Haynes interior in 1969. And the modern photos are from 2017. Those are when the house was listed. So those are listing photos. It was staged to look like that. The Getzes were famous for their Impressionist Art Collection. They own nearly 70 works of Impressionist and post-Impressionist art. Here are some of them in the living room and the entryway. And in 1988, when Edie died, the daughters auctioned 28 of the paintings at Christie's, and they sold for $85 million total, which was a record for a single owner's collection at the time. And this was one of the pieces of furniture that was not designed by Billy Haynes, the Ming era table on the right in the entry hall. Here's more of their art. They had a Degas ballerina sculpture, and that's Marilyn Monroe with the sculpture. She had dinner there in 1956 one night with the director of one of her movies, and the director took a bunch of photos of Marilyn posing in front of a lot of the art. And that's a Picasso in the bottom right, which sold for $25 million in 1988. That was the highest selling painting from the collection. And that set a record at the time for the highest sale of the Picasso. And today the highest sale is, I think, 159 million. And that's their famous Van Gogh. That's the Van Gogh you see in the back. It's a purported Van Gogh, and ever since Bill bought it in 1944, it's been disputed whether or not it's an actual Van Gogh. The Getzes were great friends with Frank Sinatra. And when Frank married Mia in 1966, they got married at the Las Vegas Sands Hotel in a hotel room. Bill and Edie were best man and matron of honor. And after the wedding ceremony, they flew back to LA on Frank's private jet, and they had the wedding party at the Getz house. So here's the living room that you saw earlier. They're standing in front of that Picasso. And I got maybe 20 photos from that party, and they're just an incredible look at Hollywood in the 60s. So you see all those people on the right. There were, in that single room, there were 12 cigarette holders, and smoking was huge at the time. And apparently there was so much smoking in the house that it colored the paintings. So when Christie's auctioned the work, they had to restore the color from a lot of the paintings. And apparently this Picasso, the blue turned into green, and they had to bring it back to blue. Here are more photos from the wedding party. That's Frank and Mia dancing. And if you look closely at what Mia is holding, I love this photo. She's holding a banana peel in one hand and a cigarette in the other. And in the background, you can, in that glass case, is the Degas ballerina. And on the right is the library that we saw earlier, and that's Rosalind Russell meeting Mia's sister, Prudence. And you see the TV is still there in the photo in the center. And when Frank and Mia got divorced, soon after they married, when Mia was shooting Rosemary's Baby, Frank served her with divorce papers on the set by her lawyer, or by his lawyer. He delivered the divorce papers. And Mia, after getting the divorce papers, went to India to study transcendental meditation with her sister and her sister Prudence. And when they were there, they were joined by the Beatles. And the story goes that Prudence was not wanting to go out and play, so she would stay in her room meditating, and the Beatles wrote the song Dear Prudence after Prudence Farrell. And today she teaches transcendental meditation in Florida. Here's Edie in the library with that famous Van Gogh. And in the right corner is another photo from the wedding party. That's Mia sitting on Richard Attenborough's lap next to Frank, and Dean Martin is behind them, and Dean's wife, Jeannie, and George Jacobs, who was Sinatra's valet. And Dean apparently had a great line about Mia when he was told that Mia was 20. He said that he has scotch that's older than Mia. And here's the famous dining room. So just like Pickfair in the 1920s, which was the epicenter of Hollywood social life, the Getz House was the epicenter of Hollywood social life for more than 20 years, from the late 40s to the 1960s. And virtually every major actor during that time, director, producer, went to the house and had dinner. And here was the dining room where they ate. Edie sat at the head of the table in the back there, underneath the Degas painting, and Bill sat at the other end. The table could seat 22 and could be moved in and out. And because it could be moved in and out, that's why there was no chandelier. So the table could always be centered, and Billy Haynes thought that it was more romantic and people looked better under candlelight. And they had a staff of 8, including a full-time chef serving everyone. And Edie was famous for keeping hostess notebooks of all of her dinner parties. And here are 2 of the hostess notebooks, which just tell an incredible story of Hollywood from 1948 on the right and 1975 on the left. So here's everyone that was invited and the dinner that was served. And when they screened a movie, she would also write in the movie that was screened. And so on the right in 1948, her handwriting is a little hard to read, so I wrote in the names. And the menu is just incredible if you look at what they served. So imagine suckling pig, fried chicken, roast beef, and spaghetti and meatballs, and sauerkraut and frankfurters all at once. And then on the left, you can see how the food changed in 1975 at the bottom. It's chicken cacciatore with rice and roast beef with gravy. And this was a party for Ronald Reagan and Nancy when Ron left office as governor of California. So a few weeks before February 11th, 1975, he had just left office. So I think this is a party for him. And you can see just this incredible list of people who were invited. Billy Wilder, the director. Freddie De Cordova was the producer of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood. Gregory Peck. Irving Swifty Lazar, the famous agent. Jack Lemmon. Norton Simon Museum. Actually, he was married at the time to Jennifer Jones, who was David Selznick's ex-wife. And the Bloomingdales were there. They lived down the street. It's just a phenomenal list. And we can go back to this later if anyone wants to look at this more or ask questions about it. And now we move to Brentwood, to Shirley Temple. And she was born in Santa Monica in 1928. That's her first house where she was born at the top. And both of these houses are still there. And she signed her contract with Fox in 1934 at age 5. And Bill Getz was an executive at Fox at the time. Then in 1935, that's her on the left at age 7, she became the most popular movie star in the world. From 1935 to 1938, she was getting 60,000 fan letters a month. And her parents bought this house in Brentwood right when they signed the Fox contract. And she was getting so many fans outside her house, there was no wall, it was just like this, that they wanted to have a house with more security. So Charles Lindbergh's baby was killed 3 years earlier, and so they were concerned about Shirley's safety, and they started looking for a house in 1935. And that's Shirley with Louis B. Mayer on the right, and at her high school graduation with David O. Selznick, who was producing a movie that was released by MGM with Shirley at the time. And here's the land that they bought. So this is in Brentwood. They bought the land in 1935 and built this house. It went all the way from Rockingham at the top, that's the street where O.J. Simpson lived, down to Sunset. This is the back of the house. Here's the front, it's on the left. And it was just an incredible playground for a kid. So you can see all this stuff that was essentially for Shirley. There was the pool and the pool house in the center, a badminton court. She had a barn where she kept a horse for her and a horse for her brother. There was a riding ring. She would ride her horse across Sunset to the Riviera Polo Fields. That is where a junior high school is now, and she would take riding lessons there. Then there was a carousel, and she had a playhouse that was, they called it the playhouse, but it was actually the size of the house. And these are photos of the backyard. She had this 150-foot roller coaster, which is the length of 2 tennis courts. And then at the bottom left is a glass brick playhouse that was built by a glass manufacturer so they could get the promotional value of it, and they gave it as a birthday present to Shirley. And that's Shirley in her swimming pool with friends. That's her standing with the white shorts and with her dog, Rowdy, her Cocker Spaniel, and that's the barn. This is what the house looked like in the front. It was about 5,000 square feet on 3 acres. Here's her bedroom. And several years ago, Shirley's family auctioned off a lot of her belongings, a lot of her dolls that she collected, a lot of the things that you see here in these photos. And fans who bought some of those things can actually identify the things that they bought in these photos. And this is the house today. So it's been subdivided into 5 separate houses. It was split apart in 1957 when Shirley's parents retired to Palm Springs and they sold the house. And at the time, I guess, they felt that the main house was too big. So they actually cut it in half. That's that circle in the center. So that's 1 and 2. Two separate people now own the main house. The playhouse is number 3. And then 4 and 5 are 2 newer houses. And then across Sunset on the left is the junior high that used to be the polo field. And here's the final house. We're in Holmby Hills. This was built in 1935, and Frank Sinatra bought it in 1948, and that's Frank with Louis B. Mayer. He did a musical at MGM in 1945 called Anchors Aweigh, and he was getting this award. The 5th owner of the house was the son of the couple on the left. That's Evelyn Walsh McLean and her husband, Edward. They called him Ned. And she was the last private owner of the Hope Diamond. That's the Hope Diamond on the right. And that's her wearing it in 1911. She bought it for $180,000 in 1911 from Cartier. And then over the years, it eventually made its way to the Smithsonian. And the last time it was insured, it was reportedly valued at $250 million. And that's her son, Ned Jr., on the right, when he got married. And soon after getting married in 1947, he bought the house. And the story behind the Hope Diamond about it being cursed really applies to the McLeans. All sorts of terrible things happened to them over the years. He owned the Washington Post, which went bankrupt. Family members were killed. All sorts of things. But so their son bought the house, and 9 months after they bought the house, he divorced his wife, Gloria Hattrick. That's Gloria and Ned on the left. And then Gloria then sells the house to Frank Sinatra, and she marries Jimmy Stewart. So that's Jimmy getting married in Beverly Hills to Gloria in the center. And then they stayed together for 44 years. And that's them on the right. That's Frank in the courtyard of the house and in 2011. Here he is with his family. They're sitting in the corner of the 2 seats at the bottom, right where they join. And that's Frank and his wife, Nancy. They called her Big Nancy because their daughter was also Nancy. That's Nancy on the left. And then Tina is the baby. And Frank Jr., the one who was kidnapped, is on the right. And then that's Frank and the kids standing or sitting on the steps going down to the pool that you see at the bottom. And they lived across the street from Walt Disney. And this is Walt Disney on his model train that he had at his house. And it was called the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad. So the street that they lived on was called Carrollwood. And this was Walt's famous 1/8 scale steam train. It actually ran on steam. And every Saturday, the kids from the neighborhood would go over to take rides on the train. And he ran the train from 1950 to 1953, when a young girl was burned by steam from the engine. And he shut it down. And he also turned his focus to Disneyland, which opened in 1955. And on the right is a picture of the first steam engine that ran around Disneyland. And it was modeled after the engine at his house. And you can see how similar they are. It was called the Lily Bell because his wife was named Lillian. Here's a great model of the of the railroad, the Carroll Pacific. So this is a model at the Disney Family Museum in the Presidio in San Francisco. And it's just an amazing museum. If you haven't been, I totally recommend it. And this is what the house looked like with the railroad in the back, or the tracks in the back. You see that tunnel at the bottom. That's also in the top center, along with that red barn. And the red barn is actually in Griffith Park. There's the little railroad there that you could take rides on, and the group that runs that railroad, Walt Disney was actually a member of when it started, and the family donated that barn there. So it's now a little mini museum, and you can see photos and train cars from Walt's railroad. The house was 5 acres, and they owned it from 1949 to 1997. Here's Ava Gardner and Frank. So 1 year after Frank bought the house with his family, he started having an affair with Ava Gardner in 1949, and he wound up leaving his wife and 3 kids, which caused just a media sensation at the time, because he was Catholic and left his family. And he married Ava. They were married from 1951 to 1957. And Nancy and her family stayed at the house until 1961. And then she sold it to Charles Tex Thornton and his wife Flora in 1961. And the Thorntons owned it for 49 years. He was the co-founder of Litton Industries, which was a major defense contractor. And it was a giant conglomerate with all sorts of divisions, including Royal Typewriters, which is still in business, and Stouffer's Frozen Foods, Litton microwave ovens, all sorts of stuff. And she was one of LA's great philanthropists. The USC Thornton School of Music is named after her. And after her death, it was sold to Brad Gray and his wife in 2010. He was the former CEO of Paramount for 12 years. And a manager, he was famous for producing The Sopranos. And he tore the house down and built this. And this was sold in 2018. And these are the same areas in 1985 and 35 years later today. And at the bottom, you see the original Sinatra house. That was the Spanish house built in the 30s. And on the right, you see it today. And the Getz house is at the top. And in this little area of Holmby Hills was just incredibly Hollywood-centric. So Clark Gable, Carole Lombard lived across from Frank Sinatra. Disney's house is on the far right. And in that 1985 photo, you can actually see the remnants of the train tracks. So if you look at the word Disney right next to the letter D, you see some brown paths that sort of go in a circle. So those are where the train tracks used to be. The house was demolished, so you see that giant white house with a dark roof on the right in 2020. That's the house today. And the Clark Gable, Carole Lombard house and the Barbra Streisand house were also demolished. And that's the other giant white house with that big pool behind it. Streisand lived there for 29 years. And then the Getz house is original, and that's at the top. And just imagine all the stories that happened in these houses from the 20s through today. It's really quite something. So thank you, Beth, and thank you, Alta, for inviting me today, and everyone here for joining us. It's been terrific. And if you live in an older house or know someone who does, don't hesitate to give me a call.
Can I have you stop? Oh, I can stop sharing your screen for you. That was really interesting. I will confess that the thing that I found most interesting were those old, weird menus. I've got a couple of questions from some of our viewers for you. Do you know anything about the Francis Marion house that was allegedly torn down by Paul Allen? I assume we're talking about Paul Allen of Microsoft fame.
Right. So when Paul bought the house and he demolished it and he planned to build a mega mansion and he never got around to it. And so when he died recently, the house went on the market, and the story was that Jeff Bezos bought it. At the same time, he bought the Jack Warner house for $165 million, which was also designed by Billy Haynes. And the funny connection there is that Jack Warner bought the house, and then he got remarried, and his wife didn't like the house. And so they went over to the Selznick's house to see their house that had just been finished. And they liked it so much that they hired the same architect to do his house. So Roland Coate, who did the Selznick house, also remodeled the Warner house. And they also liked the landscaping on the Selznick house so much that they hired the same landscape designer, Florence Yock.
I loved the love story with the interior designer also, by the way. That was nice. Do you know
they were the first openly gay couple in Hollywood.
It's clearly not the last. Do you know anything about the Charles Bickford house in Playa del Rey?
I've heard of it, but I don't know anything offhand.
Not yet. All right. What about the Mary Lasker house in Hombley Hills?
Yeah. So that's the Francis Brody house. I think
that wasn't clarified in the question that someone asked 20 minutes ago. But let's say yes.
Okay. So the Brody house was famous. That's another Billy Haynes house. And the same landscape designer who did the Getz house also did her house. Frances Brody her maiden name was Lasker. And she built this A. Quincy Jones house that's very famous, that is still there, and it's just gorgeous. And she also had a famous art collection, and they were friends with the Getzes.
Do you have any thoughts on the recent demolition of Danny Thomas's house in Trousdale Estates?
Yeah, I saw those photos on Facebook. He had this mid-century house with this very cool gate, and the owner just demolished the house to build something, and the original gate is still there. So I haven't looked to see what the original house looked like. Apparently the view is one of the best in Trousdale. But I think when any older house is demolished, it's certainly sad. So it's unfortunate.
Any thoughts on the Jack Warner house sold by David Geffen?
Yeah, that's the one that Jeff Bezos bought for $165 million. And people often ask me, if you could do the history of any house, what would you want to do? And that's probably number one. So if anyone knows Jeff, I'd be very grateful if you wanted to refer me.
Jeff Bezos.
And that's actually the only remaining legendary Hollywood mogul house that's still intact in terms of its acreage. So I think it's 11 acres, and all the other estates have been subdivided over the years. So the David O. Selznick house is now 3 different houses. Green Acres has been subdivided. So the special thing about the Warner house, one of the special things is that it's still the original property. And if you drive by it, it's amazing. The hedge is like 30 feet high. It's just enormous. So you can't see the house at all. You just see this enormous hedge. You could see it on Google Street View.
Any thoughts on the house and the driveway from the movie Sunset Boulevard? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, that's a famous one. So the interiors were all shot on a soundstage, but the driveway was an actual house where they filmed. And I recently read a book on the making of that movie, and it's one of my favorite movies.
Last question before we let you get on with your research of whatever your next project is. What's the history of your own house? Where do you live? And did Marilyn Monroe ever pose next to a Degas there?
Unfortunately, no. I live in Brentwood in a 50s ranch house, and I researched the owners, but I couldn't find anything about them. So I would love to find out, but I really don't know anything about the history of my house. But if you have time, I'm happy to go back to that menu, since that's so popular.
Oh, I mean, can I just look at the menu? I just want to point out, can you take us to the menu?
Sure. I'll share my screen.
It's the craziest menu. And can you imagine being asked to dinner for frankfurters and sauerkraut, spaghetti and meatballs, suckling pig?
Can people see it?
No.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
I can get lost. Get my mug out of here.
You're good. See it?
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that menu, the 1948 one, amazing?
Things really changed between 1948 and 1975. Also, that's a really big menu for what doesn't seem like that huge of a group.
No, well, remember, I only, it's actually pretty big because I just wrote in the famous person, but it's Mr. and Mrs. So sort of double the number of people there on the left, and that's the party. The interesting thing is that Billy Haynes was there with his boyfriend, Jimmy Shields. That's the name right under him. And Louis B. Mayer was at the party too. So one can only imagine what that was like. And apparently Louis B. Mayer was told that Billy Haynes did the house, and he liked it.
And be cool, Louis. It's just,
yeah,
it's
and the people on the left
fried chicken. My God.
Just terrific. Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire at the same party. The Getzes were also famous for having people perform in their living room. So when Fred Astaire would come to dinner often, he would perform. Or when Judy Garland would come, they would have her perform with an accompanist on the piano in the living room after dinner.
Well, it's quite an amazing era. Folks, if you missed any part of this conversation, we will have it up on altaonline.com. If you're interested in having David research your home, no matter its history, you can figure it out for you. You can click on LA House Histories. There's a link right under our video here. We're Alta Magazine. We're so grateful that you all joined us today. We hope everyone stays safe. And thanks again. Next week, we will have author Kimmy Eisel on Wednesday, 12:30 Pacific time. But otherwise, thanks so much, everyone. And a big thank you to David. That was really, really, really fun.
I really appreciate it. And it was great to be featured in the magazine. And I appreciate your time and everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, guys. All right. Take care.
Bye.